Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation. As Director of Lectures and Seminars, it's my privilege to welcome you and those who join us online to our Douglas and Sarah Allison Auditorium. We, of course, ask everyone here in-house if you will be so kind to check that your cell phones have been turned off as we prepare to begin. It is always appreciated. And, of course, we will post the program on the Heritage homepage as soon as possible following today's program for your future reference. And our internet viewers are always welcome to send questions or comments, simply emailing us at speaker@heritage.org. Before we continue with our normal routine, however, today I would like to formally note that this is an official day of mourning for the Dutch people, as remains of victims from the ill-fated Malaysian Flight 17 are returned to their homeland. I would ask all of us to join in a moment of silence in memory of the souls of the departed, in respect for the sorrow of their loved ones, and acknowledgement of the grief their countrymen and so many others share. Thank you. We will proceed with our program. Our host for today is David Azarad, who serves Heritage as Director of our B. Kenneth Simon Center for Principles and Politics. David?
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Heritage Foundation for the third lecture in our series on lessons for conservatives from Goldwater to the Tea Party. George Will kicked things off for us a couple of months ago by reflecting on the quixotic 1964 Goldwater campaign for the White House. Though Goldwater lost the election, as he well knew he would, his campaign did re-inject principled conservative ideas into the national bloodstream. And in so doing, he set the stage for the Reagan presidency. As George Will put it, Goldwater won in 1964. It just took them 16 years to count the votes. But even with Reagan, conservatives only managed to capture the White House. The other house, the House of Representatives, seemed out of reach. It had been under solid Democratic control since 1954. Political scientists were writing books about the House Republicans as the, quote, permanent minority. Most Republicans had in fact resigned themselves to the state of affairs, but one in particular didn't. Politics, it is often said, is the art of the possible. Occasionally, though, a politician comes along who expands the realm of the possible. This is just what freshman Congressman Newt Gingrich did. He not only decided that Republicans would capture the House, they would do so by championing conservative ideas. Gingrich, in effect, decided that the Republicans would stop being the Me Too party, that they would offer the American people a real conservative alternative to the regnant liberal dogmas. As Goldwater had done before him, Gingrich decided to offer the American people a choice, not an echo. And thus was born the contract with America. Some dismissed it as an electoral gimmick. Some mistook it for a party platform. It was, in fact, an entirely new creature. The contract was a list of promises that House GOP candidates in the 1994 election pledged to vote on if elected to office. The contract promised two things: structural reforms to the way Congress worked, and most importantly, in my opinion, to the way the House and its feudal committee system worked, and secondly, a conservative policy reform agenda. And boy, did it work. The GOP not only recaptured the House, they were in control of the whole of Congress for the first time in 50 years. Not a single incumbent Republican lost an election, while many sitting Democrats did, including Tom Foley, the first Speaker of the House to be ousted in an election in over a century. The New York Times called it a political upheaval of historic proportions. Make no mistake, it was not just a Republican revolution, but a conservative revolution. You could say that it had in fact taken 30 years to count the votes of the 1964 election. This year marks the 20th anniversary of the contract with America, and we've invited Newt Gingrich to reflect on it and tease out for us some of the lessons it holds for conservatives today. What was the lasting impact of the Republican Revolution? Was it in the realm of policy, or in reforming the way Congress worked, or in moving the debate to the right? What did it accomplish? Where did it fall short? Our speaker today does not need much of an introduction. We all know his rather extraordinary trajectory, from history professor at West Georgia College, to congressman representing Georgia's 6th District, to Speaker of the House in the 104th and 105th Congresses, to the one-man think tank he is today. He's the best-selling author of 24 fiction and nonfiction books, including most recently Breakout, which I hope will once and for all put the lie to this stupid idea that conservatives are stuck in the past and that the left is the party of the future. Heritage's longtime president, Ed Feulner, who regrettably couldn't be here with us today, once said, "Newt Gingrich is a rare find in Washington. He is articulate, charismatic, and loaded with innovative ideas fully grounded in our shared conservative principles." Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming back to the Heritage Foundation our good friend, Newt Gingrich.
Well, thank you all very, very much. And Clist and I are always delighted to have a good reason to come back to Heritage. Heritage was extraordinarily important in both developing the Reagan Revolution and in developing the Contract with America. So to be here, to have a chance to talk about lessons of conservatism as it applies, I think, to 2014, 2016, and beyond, I actually would recommend to all of you that conservatives right now and Republicans, which are not always synonymous, should actually be planning back from the summer or fall of 2017. Because the purpose of elections is to win and then to actually use the power that has been loaned to you by the American people. And that's how we ended up both in 80 with Reagan and in 94 with the contract. I was actively engaged in both. I'm sorry Ed Feulner's not here today because there's no single leader in the intellectual community who had a greater impact at a practical level over a 30-year period than Ed Feulner. And if you go back and look at Mandate for Leadership, this enormous volume that was very cleverly put together. It's never been repeated, just as the contract hasn't been, because Heritage actually reached out to the people likely to be appointed to the jobs they were describing the mandate for. I think there were some 250 people who contributed to the mandate. So they spent all of 79-80 writing the mandate, and they spent all of 81 implementing it. And it's the most comprehensive conservative publication for fundamentally starting to rethink the government, something we really need again in 15 and 16 if we're going to be serious in moving the country in 17. If a Republican wins on a negative campaign, they have no political capital and no consensus by which to govern. If a Republican wins without having carefully thought through the changes they want, they will inevitably be co-opted by the city, the lobbyists, the bureaucracy, and the cocktail parties of Georgetown. And interestingly, the one person who's written about the contract who really understood it best is Chuck Schumer. Chuck wrote a book, I think, in 2007. And he emphasized that the contract was, in fact, a management document. It was designed to lay out for the House Republicans a work project so decisive and so bold that for the first 100 days, they would be so different than the city was used to, that we would have fundamentally moved both the House Republican Party and the city much further than anybody expected on election night. So let me go back briefly and talk about lessons. I'm delighted Heritage is doing this. And I think it's very important to remember, Goldwater matters because despite the defeat, he actually stood for something. And I'm saying this, one of the reasons I agreed to come here and talk today is I am deeply opposed to any consultant or any political staffer who talks to the news media about the campaign this fall being a referendum on Obama. And I want to make this quite clear. As a professional who has done this since August of 1958, who's participated in a series of fairly successful projects, I regard it as maniacally stupid and unprofessional to think you can get away with a purely negative campaign. You turn off all the moderates, you turn off all the independents, you drive down the turnout. If we had run an anti-Clinton campaign in 1994, we still wouldn't have been in the majority. And you need to understand how big a change this was. From 1954 to 1994, for 40 years, there is no Republican majority in the House. Since 1928, no Republican majority had been reelected. We had two majorities, 46 and 52. Both lasted one term. Since 1994, we have kept the House for 16 out of 20 years. Now that is a political revolution. It's a fundamental change in the center of gravity in this city. And of course, it drives the Washington Post and CBS News crazy. I mean, John Boehner actually has been leading a group that actually didn't want to give Barack Obama whatever the latest radical thing was that Obama wanted. And this act of defiance has just really been a key factor in how the media has dealt with the House Republicans, who have passed now 290 bills that Harry Reid has refused to take up. Something you probably won't see on the Today Show. But just think about how different that is. Think what this would be like if Harry Reid and Nancy Pelosi were both in charge right now. And you have some sense of how important it is that we have the House. Now, how did it happen? First of all, we stood on Ronald Reagan's shoulders. I mean, you take the contract, all of the parts that relate to general public policy, every one of them came out of Reagan. And in fact, if you go back, welfare reform, which is in some ways our greatest long-term achievement, was first articulated in 1966 by the candidate for governor. And grown gradually as an issue, very dramatically helped by Charles Murray at AEI, who wrote an extraordinary book called Losing Ground, very decisively helped by a book called The Tragedy of American Compassion. Ultimately, by the time we came around in 1996, after 30 years of debate, 92% of the country favored welfare reform, including 88% of the people on welfare. And even today, if the issue is, are you better off being dependent or working, this is an overwhelmingly work-oriented country. It's just conservatism can't quite figure out how to make that a practical cultural referendum, or we would win decisively even with most of the very poor. Because work and a better future beats dependency and a limited future. So we were standing on Reagan's shoulders. We were standing on a belief that ideas mattered. We were standing on a belief that, in fact, candidates who could get on radio and get on television and talk about ideas had a huge advantage. Now, this was a very practical document. There's not a single item in the contract's 10 public policy issues that scored below 70%. And the reason was simple. You have a brand new first-time candidate for Congress in a district we have not won in 20 or 30 years, and you want them to be on talk radio at drive time in the morning, and you want them to be able to say, well, I'm for welfare reform. Everybody driving to work nods yes. I'm for a balanced budget. Everybody driving to work nods yes. You go down the list, on every single item, people are nodding yes. After the fourth or fifth topic, they start thinking, gee, that's a pretty good guy. I could vote for that person. And so our whole goal was to create a national momentum that would carry the last marginal seat. For example, not only do we beat Foley, first time, as you pointed out, that a speaker's lost in a century, but we beat Danny Rostenkowski in downtown Chicago. Unthinkable when the year began. We beat Chairman Brooks in Texas. Unthinkable when the year began. And part of the reason we did is we targeted everybody. I think we ran 433 candidates that year. So there are a lot of lessons to be learned from that. But let me apply them to where we are and where we're going. And I think it's very important as Jim DeMent continues to evolve the Heritage Foundation and continues to build on it, that all of you who are actively involved at Heritage understand how important this is. We have an opportunity to go back to a phrase from Ronald Reagan, who said at one point that the key is not right versus left, it's future versus past. It's up or down. Up with civilization, down with barbarism. And we have an opportunity, I think, in the next 3 years, opportunity literally this summer and fall, to begin to be the movement of the future and to allow the left to become the movement of the past. And I believe, and I tell young people, and if I talk, for example, to interns, I tell all of them I believe their generation may be the most creative in government since the Founding Fathers. And this is not hyperbole. The reason I feel so strongly is we have crossed a technological threshold which allows us to think in fundamentally new terms. I'm going to give you two very simple examples of why the future versus past is going to work. And the only question is how rapidly we can learn this and whether we can learn it as conservatives faster than the left figures it out. The first one's very easy, automatic teller machines. How many of you have gotten money out of an ATM outside the United States? Raise your hand if you've ever gotten money outside the U.S. Over half of you, right? Think about what the process was. You walk up to an anonymous machine. You put in a plastic card. The machine lights up. It offers you 6 or 8 languages. You pick one of the languages you're really good at. You punch in a 4-number code. It reaches out, I did it recently in Kazakhstan, reached out 10 time zones, over 7 international borders, found my bank, verified who I was, validated that I had cash, and gave me the local currency. By the way, at a rate you don't actually know the exchange rate. But your gamble is that it's better than the hotel. Am I right? Am I describing reality here? In the times that Callista and I have done it, it normally takes less than 11 seconds. The actual, I was told the other day by somebody who used to work for Visa, the actual technological time span is 3 seconds, but you got to get the machine to light up, you've got to punch in the code, you got to put in the number, and then the machine has to count out the money. But the actual internet-based technological exchange is 3 seconds. How many of you have found generally that it's very, very fast? Just raise your hand. I mean, how many of you found it to be amazingly fast? Has anybody here actually had a mistake made in the machine system itself? Not you punching something in, but has anybody here been cheated by the machines? Now, I want to give you 2 examples. So all of us agree that there's about an 11-second transfer over multiple countries. It takes 177 days to transfer medical records from the Department of Defense to the Veterans Administration. Now, when I talk future past, anybody trying to fix the current VA is in the past. They are prison guards of the past. Because it's hopeless. I'll tell you why it's hopeless in just a second. But let me stick with accuracy. So all of you are out running all over the planet, putting in your plastic cards, getting money out, knowing you still have money at home because it keeps giving you money. Remarkable accuracy. Last year, the Internal Revenue Service sent out $4 billion in tax refunds to people who should not have gotten them. My favorite is they sent 343 checks to one house in Shanghai. Now, I want you to think about this as a practical matter. You know, bureaucracy sends one bad check to a house in Shanghai, you think, it's a mistake. Mistakes happen. They send 2. It's an embarrassment. They send 3. It's an outrage. How do you explain a bureaucracy so stupid that it can send 343 checks to a house in Shanghai and not notice it? Now, let me give you the second example. By the way, they send more to a house in Lithuania. It's in the 400 and some number. They send a lot more to places in America. I was giving this as a framework. Now, why is this all so hard? And all of you have heard these stories, but here's the big difference. Second technological breakthrough. How many of you have a smartphone? Just raise your hand. Out of curiosity, this being a modern and sophisticated group, is there anybody here who has a cell phone that is not a smartphone? Is there 1, 2, 3? Anybody over here? 4, 5? This is really exciting. Do any of you work for the federal government? I mean, I'm just checking in here. Now, just follow me for a second, because this is central. This is totally outside current politics, and this will give you a flavor of why future versus past is going to be the primary definer of the next 20 years. This device is the equivalent of a 2003 laptop computer. But that really totally misstates it, because this device is the entryway to the planet. Example, how many of you have GPS on your smartphone? How many of you no longer use a map? Think about this in terms of sheer speed. There's a new device somebody at MIT just developed that is an app for your smartphone that allows you to measure your eyes and figure out what kind of contact lens you need. Imagine that you were rebuilding a veterans service system, not the Veterans Administration, a veterans service system, starting with a veteran and a smartphone, and then building out. Dr. Mike Burgess, who's a congressman from Texas, has 8 apps that are medical apps on his smartphone, including an EKG device. So you can give yourself an EKG and then send it electronically to the doctor. What if there was a veterans app on the veteran's smartphone, so when you registered and said you needed an appointment, your smartphone knew that you had done it. Your smartphone kept the record. They couldn't, as they did in Los Angeles, eliminate 3,000 veterans from the file because it's on your smartphone. And if you don't get the appointment within a week, you could send a note to the regional office. And if you don't get it within another week, you could send it to the national office. I'm just giving you a flavor of it. This is not how do we fix the current bureaucracy. This is how do we rethink human activities to maximize the power the individual has and to profoundly replace the current structure. So here's a very simple model for you to think about. Modern bureaucratic structures were invented about the same time as the manual typewriter, around 1870 or 1880. So when people say to you, we're going to reform the VA, what they mean is you're going to have a slightly better manual typewriter. Because nobody in the current system is allowed to think clearly about the scale of change that would be involved if you use modern technology. So I'm going to tell you something that may shock you coming from a conservative. I think one of our goals should be to turn the Pentagon into a triangle. Just think about it for a second. The 23,000 people working in a building built in the middle of World War II using paper-based bureaucratic models in order to have too many levels of hierarchy to slow everything down and increase the cost of everything. Now, if we're going to be tough-minded about government bureaucracy, why wouldn't we be tough-minded about it in the Pentagon? I always tell people I'm a hawk, but I'm a cheap hawk. And I don't regard waste in the Pentagon in some ways as worse than waste elsewhere because the money should be spent on combat troops and on combat equipment. It shouldn't be spent on paper-based bureaucracies. So we're going to be in a fight, and this is very important to move this party to understand this. Our argument with Hillary Clinton is not, whether or not she was psychologically traumatized as a child by living in poverty and leaving the White House so impoverished that she could barely function in the modern world and almost once thought about taking a subway because of her lack of money. It's a lot of fun, but it has no impact on the country. And it offers the country no choice of a different future. Our goal should be, as it was with Heritage in the 1970s, to create a dramatic agenda of the future, which knits together every pioneer of the future in the country who's inventing new and better ways of doing things, and which, by the way, reaches across the aisle. I'll tell you bluntly, every conservative should read Gavin Newsom's book, Citizenville. Gavin Newsom is the liberal Democratic Lieutenant Governor of California, former mayor of San Francisco, but his book is the best single book. Now, it's not quite as good as Breakout in terms of general policy, but it's the best single book about explaining how empowering the citizen in the age of the internet fundamentally changes how you think about all government. Not how do you get a better bureaucracy, how do you get a different system. And we want to be the movement that reaches out. I was with Jack Kemp in 1979 when Kemp went to California to convince Reagan that supply-side economics mattered and that the 3-year tax cut was central to our getting the economy moving again. Reagan did not invent supply-side economics. Reagan adopted and championed supply-side economics. And I say that because we shouldn't worry so much about who's the personality. We will nominate somebody. I am absolutely confident. What we should ask is, what are they going to campaign on? What are the ideas so large, the solutions so powerful, the ability to improve the lives of every American of every ethnic background in every neighborhood? President Obama is very worried about children. I wish he would visit Chicago. Fact is, 82 Americans were shot over the 4th of July in Chicago, 17 died. And yet the whole national establishment's numb. But conservatives ought to have the courage, and I'm delighted to see Paul Ryan going into a number of communities and talking to people who want a better future, hope for a better future. I'm delighted to see Marco Rubio talking about the solutions of the 21st century, and he's the first person I've seen who began talking about Hillary as a great advocate of the 20th century. And that's what you have to be if you're a Democrat. You think the government employee union with its 800-page contract at VA is going to be for change? You think the teachers union at LA Unified is going to be for change? So we have an opportunity, I think, to be the movement that offers a dramatically better future by offering better ideas. And we have a chance to go back and do once again what Heritage helped us do in 1980. And that's create such a vivid and such a powerful opportunity that it makes all the difference. One last comment, particularly those of you who are younger. The key to 1994 was cheerful persistence. I ran in 74 during Watergate and lost. I came back and ran in 76 with Jimmy Carter at the head of the Democratic ticket and lost. I finally won in 1978 and convinced then Congressional Campaign Committee Chairman Congressman Guy Vanderjack that having been in the minority for 24 years, we ought to have a planning process to get to be in the majority. And he said in December of 78, he said, that is a great idea, why don't you chair it? I had not even been sworn in yet. I always remind people, we lost in 80, 82, 84, 86, 88, 90, and 92. I was involved every single year. We were trying every single year. And it was very, very uphill. Historic change requires historic effort. The only way to sustain historic effort is cheerful persistence. That's why I watch the pictures of Reagan. He's always smiling. Watch pictures of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He's always smiling. These are leaders who had a remarkable discipline and who understood that people and followers invest their fears in the leader's courage. So if the leader doesn't have courage, it gets really tricky for the followers. And so I recommend to all of you, we have a chance, when you run into Republican staff, you run into Republican members, you run into Republican candidates, you run into Republican consultants or pollsters, you tell them, we have to be for positive things. We have to become the movement of the future. We have to use the great opportunities to create solutions at every level. And if we do that, we will have earned the right to govern the country. And if we then keep our word, as we did in 94, and as Ronald Reagan did in 1980, the country will then reward us by giving us a generation of opportunities to continue to lead. I'm delighted to be here, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you, Speaker Gingrich. I'll take my prerogative as the host to ask the first question, and then I'll let Mr. Gingrich field the questions himself. One of the more amazing things I find about the Republican Revolution in terms of a lasting impact were the reforms you made to the structure of the House. Bring the power back to the Speaker, to the party, away from the committees and the subcommittees. Could you tell us a little bit more about that, and also what sorts of reforms we should be implementing today in the House if we wanted to push further in that direction?
That's a good question. I mean, I think, first of all, it's important to remember that, and this is in some ways the essence of conservatism, many of the reforms we made were designed so that they'd be self-sustaining. For example, if you establish term limits for chairmen, the chairman might like to end that process. The problem they have is everybody below them loves the process. So they can never get the votes in conference to repeal it. And that was part of our thinking. You also have to be prepared to, the key to my leadership model was listen, learn, help, and lead. And I'll give you a very specific example. We had, well, two examples. We had Jim Nussle go around, because we hadn't been in charge in 40 years. And we suddenly discovered, with the help of the architect of the Capitol, that there were entire rooms we didn't know existed. I mean, they would just literally walk over, because Capitol is an enormous building. So 2,500 people work there. Just, it looks smaller because of its proportionality, but it's a huge building. And so they go walking around these corridors, and they kept finding all sorts of stuff we didn't know even existed. So one of our commitments had been that we would do a professional audit of the House, which had never been done since the creation of the House in 1789. And we brought in a professional firm, and they spent 6 months looking at the documents and the records. And I'll never forget the meeting we had, which I was part of, and they came in and they said, "We can't audit the House." And I said, "What do you mean you can't audit the House?" They said, "There are no auditable records." They said, what we would have to do is create a system of records for the future which could then be audited. I mean, that's how big the jump was. And so, of course, we looked at each other, and we were still new enough, we didn't realize that there were probably profound reasons the Democrats had not been audited. And so we created the modern House clerical system that actually enables the House to be audited every single year. But there were a whole series of these kind of things that we did. Most of them actually were bringing the House into modernity. I would say the greatest problem, and I have no solution for this, there are two great problems, and I'm not sure either one will be solved. The first is that the Senate and the White House should fundamentally overhaul how we nominate people to presidential appointments. The security clearance process is absurd. The process of vetting people is insane. Tom Foley used to have this wonderful story about being interviewed by a young lady who was in charge of checking whether or not he should get through the White House personnel process. And she said, "I noticed that there are a number of newspaper articles that are controversial about you." And he said, "Yes, I was Speaker of the House." And she said, "Well, do you think this controversy will slow you down from getting approved by the Senate?" And he said, "Young lady, I know every member in both parties on the committee, and I suspect I will be approved the day I come up. And I suspect I'll be approved on the floor the day they report it, because I was Speaker of the House." And she dutifully writes this stuff down. He's telling us this at the Defense Policy Board one day. Now, this is the process we currently have. And it's crazy. At the time that the P-3 was shot down, or forced down rather, off China, there were only 2 presidentially appointed people who'd been approved by the Senate. This is, I think, in April. This is destructive of America. So the first thing I would say is the Senate and the White House should jointly clean up the whole process of vetting, security clearance, and approval of nominees, because it is harmful to the United States. It's not a game. It's not senatorial prerogative. It's not White House staff prerogative. It is destructive of the ability of the United States to run the government. Second, I would say that both the House and Senate should really rethink how they'll never do this, but they should patriotically rethink the structure of jurisdiction. If you look at the number of places that the Department of Homeland Security theoretically reports, it is an absurdity. And it's much easier for the Congress to reform the executive branch because it isn't their world, and it's very hard for them to rethink their own jurisdictions because it gets deeply involved in ego and interest group and so forth. But it is really destructive, the way in which we have confused and inefficient jurisdictions in the Congress today. So, questions? Roman?
Speaker, if I can
Wait, he's going to give you a microphone so that everybody can hear you.
Mr. Speaker, if I can still address you that way.
Sure.
Roman Buehler with Madison Coalition. We hear a lot about the overreach of the executive branch on federal regulation. And Republicans in the House proposed the REINS Act to require that regulations be approved by Congress, but it's not going anywhere. Reid's not going to allow a vote, and this president wouldn't sign it. Who knows whether the next president would. So a two-part question. What do you think of the idea that major regulations ought to be approved by Congress? And second, what do you think of the idea that just as states forced Congress to propose the original Bill of Rights, a movement of state leaders might be able to force Congress to propose a regulation freedom amendment that would be similar to the REINS Act?
I think it's conceivable that if enough states put pushed on it that they could get something serious done. I think that something like the REINS Act is the right direction. I also think, frankly, the government's just way too big. I mean, one of the things we should be developing right now is a very bold decentralization back to the states based on a simple question. I mean, is the federal government capable of doing it? And I would argue, for example, if you look at Medicaid, where you are likely to have a worse health outcome if you are on Medicaid than if you're uninsured. That is clear Medicaid is a failed system, and it's clear that Washington has no hope of fixing it. So I would argue for decentralization to the 50 states to allow them to try to figure out how to help people, poor people have health care so that you could have a genuine laboratory of democracy at the state level in a way that we don't today have. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Matthew. I'm with Senator Hatch. Yeah, I'd kind of like to follow up on that question with Medicaid. So when President Clinton vetoed the two first proposals from the Republicans, then afterwards you proposed another one, and ultimately you dropped the Medicaid provisions like last minute. What was the decision process and for the timing? Because it was an election year, and it could have made President Clinton look bad, could have made Bob Dole look better, or what was the whole decision on timing?
Yeah, our decision process was a very robust argument in the House Republican Conference between those who wanted us to stay with a vetoed bill and those who believed that if we sent Clinton a clean welfare reform bill, the pressure on him to sign it would be overwhelming. And that if we actually passed welfare reform, you'd guarantee re-election of the House Republicans. And remember, we had not been reelected since 1928, so we did not take getting reelected in 1996 at all lightly. We thought it was a harder campaign than 1994 had been. And that was the decision, that if we didn't separate the two, that he would never sign it, and that the country, in fact, wanted welfare reform dramatically more. They were dramatically more prepared for welfare reform than they were for Medicaid reform. And so that's why we separated the two. Yes, sir.
Hello, unfortunately. Hello, I read your tweet in the morning, and today in Tel Aviv there are no flights. And I want to have what's your point of view? What's going on in the world? Russia, Syria, the disaster in Iraq, what's going on in Israel? What happened during the last 3-4 years? What happened with this administration? And what happened? What's your point for the future? What's going on here? The world has become crazy,
This is a question.
or something is failing very bad here?
I feel like Bill Buckley when he ran for mayor of New York, and a reporter said, in 90 seconds, can you tell us how you'll fix the city? But I think the question's serious and important. So let me just start with the specific you raised, which was where I totally approve of Mayor Bloomberg, who also tweeted this morning because he was on an El Al flight. I think that it was an act of cowardice by the United States government. I think there was zero reason to stop our flights into Ben Gurion. And I think that it is an extraordinary victory for Hamas. And I think we need to understand the Obama administration has handed Hamas an enormous victory psychologically. And I am personally deeply offended by the elite view that the side that fires 2,000 rockets is the moral equivalent of the side which is trying not to kill civilians. And I think the combination of Kerry and the Secretary General of the United Nations is a pro-Hamas mission. As I understand it, Kerry right now is trying to pressure the Israelis into accepting a more pro-Hamas ceasefire than the Egyptians offered, which is exactly the wrong direction. If the United States had a neighbor whose stated public policy was the destruction of the United States, and if that neighbor fired 2,000 missiles in the United States, we would annihilate them. I mean, literally, again, I'm a historian. This is where we got to Hamburg and Dresden and Tokyo. Because our attitude was, you want to know what total war is? And instead we have this absurd game where Hamas dances out, kills a few people, dances back, hides deliberately behind civilians, and the Israelis are then blamed for killing the civilians that Hamas is hiding behind. Now, this is not tolerable. And it fits into the larger question. When you're in a period, and this frankly goes back to the Bush administration, this is not just Obama. George W. Bush's speech immediately after 9/11 was right. There's a triangle of evil, and you're either with us or you're against us. His speech, his second inaugural, was extraordinarily courageous. We stand for freedom. Nobody in the Bush administration really understood what that meant. Because the truth is, I used to tell audiences regularly, I can guarantee you democracy in Iraq, and we won't be there a day longer than we've been in Korea. But don't think you're going to go into a country fundamentally alien to Western values, fundamentally inexperienced in the rule of law, fundamentally torn apart by a three-way ethnic civil war. And you're going to dance through it for a couple of years, get out, and have it change profoundly. It's not going to happen. It's not how history unfolds. We got democracy in Germany and Japan because they had been decisively defeated, and we didn't give them any choices. And instead, we're going into places, where the dominant leader of the Shia would not meet with non-Muslims. Now, that tells you something about how big the gap is. And I was very struck. I believe we are, and I don't have quite the language for this yet, but I believe we are moving into an era of evil. And I'm very much reminded of what happened in the 1930s. And Alan First has written a series of brilliant novels about being a normal, regular person leading a normal life in the 30s, watching Mussolini and Hitler and Franco and Stalin and the rise of the dictatorships. You look at ISIS, you look at Putin, you look at what's happening in Syria, and again, we worry about, the president says he's so worried about civilian casualties. Would you like to guess how many Syrians have been killed? Would you like to guess how many Iraqis have been killed? I mean, go down the list. How many Afghans have been killed? How many Ukrainians have been killed? The idea that our selective worry is for the people surrounding Hamas in Gaza strikes me as an example of being totally out of touch with reality. And I think we're in for a long, difficult period. And to have people say, I am really worried about violence in Central America at a time when I worry about violence in Chicago, just again tells me that this selective, myopic worldview of our elites is very dangerous. Let's see this one right here. I'll come to you next. I'll come to you right after.
As a conservative millennial, one of the things that I'm concerned about is that I'm listening to you speak about the changes you would make, upgrading different departments in the government, and I'm sitting here nodding my head, yes, And the problem that I see is that change to my generation means change in how people look. It might be change in race or gender or sexual orientation of our leaders. It may be the change in younger people coming in. So I guess my question to you is, how do we convince millennials that change means fundamentally changing the way government works, not the way government looks?
Well, first of all, I think if you change it from, take one of the projects I'd like to get Heritage to pick up is to, and I'd like to have both the House and Senate Republicans pick up, is to start with the smartphone and say, what does it mean for public policy? So I would suggest to you that if when you learn, for example, that there are currently 93,000 medical apps available for the smartphone, and that the Food and Drug Administration wants to start regulating them. You can go almost anywhere in America and say to millennials, do you think the federal bureaucrats should control your smartphone? And you have a conversation started, okay? If you watch the University of California, which briefly and apparently inadvertently said that it would not pay for any of its employees who used Uber. And you say, would you like to have government eliminate Uber? And you start down a whole list of these things. I also think, frankly, for millennials, we're going to have a pretty good conversation to just say, would you like to have a job? Do you like this guy who's really fancy and who promises you regularly? There's a great article this morning about how often he has said, "We will not rest." You name the topic. At some point, Barack Obama said, "We will not rest until this is done." And then they had next to it him golfing or him swimming or him, So at what point do we just have a conversation about competence? I don't think, although Reagan had understood vaudeville and Reagan understood movies and TV, I don't think Reagan competed with younger Americans for votes based on doing the next movie with a chimpanzee. I think what Reagan did is he said, do you want to live in a world where freedom is expanded and where tyranny has shrunk, or do you want to live in Jimmy Carter's chaos? And an amazing percent of younger people thought, better future good, chaos bad. So just watch Obama failing and offer people in your own generation two choices. You really want to spend your entire lifetime watching America decay with your job opportunities decaying, your retirement opportunities decaying, your chance of going on a nice vacation decaying, your chance of finding a safe place you can go on vacation decaying. How many countries will we cut off from airlines before we figure out that the world's dangerous? So if you think that's an acceptable future, you got a party. Bill and Hillary and Barack will do all they can to make sure that they decay happily with you. But if you would like to be in a group that actually wants to create a better future for you, not just theoretically, then I think we have a chance to create a whole new conversation. Yes, ma'am. Hold on. The microphone is coming.
My fear, and I hope I live to see this, if we have a Republican Party right now that cannot yet figure out what happened to Eric Cantor, are they going to commit suicide again? Are there powers to be within the Republican Party that have figured this out? Because from where I sit in Rockville,
I don't know. Part of the reason I came here today and was so blunt about the whole notion of negative campaigns, if Cantor's defeat doesn't get across the idea that running negative campaigns is a limited tool, but you have a whole range of consultants whose entire, income base is designing stupid negative campaigns. And that's how they earn a living. That's what their capital investment is. They don't know anything about issues. They have no idea about they don't like being positive. If we had listened to the consultants in 1994, we would never have done the contract. And so I think you've got to decide it. But I came in part to recruit you to say to the Republicans, if you don't have something positive to say, you are not. First of all, I think they'll have a hard time winning the Senate on a purely negative campaign, because people aren't going to turn out to vote. I'm very concerned that we're in this cycle. I just watched a primary in Georgia where both sides were negative for the last 3 weeks, and the result is both of them were now behind Michelle Nunn, because all people had seen for 3 solid weeks was negative stuff about both of them. Well, I don't think that's very healthy for the country, and I don't think it's very healthy for the Republican Party, and I worry more about the country than the party. Over here, because I've
This will be the last one.
okay, then here you go.
Good afternoon. Good to see you again. Your soulmate, Jack Kemp, used to say people won't care how much you know until they know that you care. How would you assess the brand problem of the conservative movement, and who would be the 2 or 3 individuals or institutions that might be best positioned to focus on the brand problem, getting permission to have the conversations, to share the ideas that you've laid out this afternoon?
Well, it's a good question, and I remember I learned a lot from Jack Kemp, and that rule was one of them. The 2 great rules that I learned about communications were Kemp, who did say people don't care that you know until they know that you care, and Margaret Thatcher, who said first you win the argument, then you win the vote, and it took me years to figure out they come in that order. They have to know that you care before you can win the argument. And I think that's very important. I would say one of the great secrets, which doesn't penetrate the city as much as it should, although there is a page 1 story this morning about Rick Perry, is the governors. You go across this country, Republican governors are creative. They're solving problems. They're getting things done. They're making a huge change. And in state by state, you just see more and more people doing a good job. And my hunch is we will probably end up nominating a governor. And I think there are 6 or 7 or 8 of them who are clearly in that league that they could be the nominee. And I think that's healthy. I always tell people that we have no front runner right now. We just have a lot of runners. But I think that's good. I think it's going to be terrific. And in almost every case, the people who are likely to be nominated have done real things back home that have in a significant way achieved something that's either improved education or it's improved health or you can go down the list. And so I think the governors are in dramatically better shape. The Congress has a huge problem. I had the same problem when I was Speaker. It's 535 faces, which means it's no face. And it's in Washington. And the legislative process on a good day is terrible, because it's terrible. It's not because any one person is bad. It's because you got 435 House members who won elections, 100 senators who won elections, and a president with a veto pen. And it's really hard. I always remind people that because they won their own elections, it's the equivalent of having 435 senior class presidents all walk into the House chamber, each of them going, I know because I won, and forgetting so the other 434. And then, of course, you have the Senate, and as a House member, it's very hard for me to speak calmly about the Senate, in which you have 100 presidents who have not yet been sworn in, who walk in simultaneously wondering why they really have to pay attention to all of these lesser people. And by that they mean the other senators, not the House members, because they have no intention of paying attention to the House members. And so, but that's the nature of the system. That has always been the nature of the system. And I'll just close this thought, because you always get these, look how bitter politics are. Just remind your friends when this comes up. We have not in modern times had a former vice president shoot a former Secretary of the Treasury. That was done by Aaron Burr to Alexander Hamilton. So when people say, gee, hasn't it gotten a lot worse? The correct answer is no. Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you very much, and if you're interested, stay tuned. We'll be receiving an email for the fourth and last lecture series on the Tea Party, sometimes in the fall, with speakers as yet to be determined. Thank you very much.